Elias Carter slammed his last coins onto a poker table he hadn't planned to touch that night. Not because he wanted to win, not because he needed the money, but because a man was using a human being as a betting chip, and every other soul in that saloon was laughing about it. The woman standing behind the gambler didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood there with her hands folded and her eyes already gone somewhere far away, like she'd learned a long time ago that hoping only made the falling worse. Elias had lived alone on that mountain for 9 years. He was about to understand why. If this story already has your heart racing, stay with me, because what happens next will take your breath away. Before we go further, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to its end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that saloon, and to the night that changed 2 broken lives forever. The winter of 1882 came down hard on Black Hollow, Colorado, the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it stayed, settled into the bones of the town and the bones of the men who lived there, and made everything feel a little more desperate than it already was. Black Hollow was not a pretty place. It never had been. It was a mining town built in a hurry by men who believed gold was just below every rock, and when the gold ran thin, the gambling halls filled in the gap. The saloon on the main road, a place called the Broken Spur, ran 7 nights a week, loud and smoky, and crowded with men who had come west with big dreams and were now just trying to get through another season without losing everything they had left. Elias Carter had no interest in any of it. He came down from the mountain twice a year, once in late spring for supplies, and once in early winter before the passes closed, and left a man truly cut off from the world below. He didn't talk much when he came to town. He didn't drink with strangers, or sit at card tables, or get pulled into conversations he hadn't started. He bought what he needed, settled what he owed, and went back up. He had done it that way for 9 years. That night, he was supposed to be in and out of Black Hollow in less than 2 hours. He had stopped at the Broken Spur only because the general store was locked early, and the owner's wife told him through the window to come back after 8. He didn't want whiskey, didn't want company. He just needed somewhere to stand out of the wind while he waited, and the saloon was the only place open on the south end of the road. He found a spot near the back wall, away from the bar, away from the card tables, and ordered coffee because it was the only thing he trusted himself to want. He was watching the door and thinking about the trail back up and whether the snow on the North Pass was going to be manageable by morning when the room changed. It didn't happen all at once. It was the kind of change that moved through a crowd like a slow current, conversations dropping away, laughter cutting short, men turning in their chairs one by one to look at something happening near the center table. Elias turned too. There were 4 men at the table. 3 of them he didn't know. The 4th was Walter Briggs, a man Elias recognized from previous trips to town, a small-time gambler and general disappointment who always seemed to be at the bottom of whatever trouble had recently been stirred up in Black Hollow. Walter's face was the color of old candle wax. His hands were shaking. The other men at the table were leaning forward, and their expressions were not pleasant. "You're tapped out, Walter," one of them said. His name was Denton Cross, and Elias knew him by reputation, a man who ran numbers for the bigger gambling outfits further south. "You got nothing left to put down." "I've got something," Walter said. His voice cracked in the middle of the words. "I've got something worth your while." "What could you possibly have, you sorry?" "Her," Walter said. And that was when Elias saw the woman. She had been standing behind Walter's chair the whole time. Elias hadn't noticed her because she stood so still, so deliberately invisible, that she seemed to have borrowed the skill from someone who had spent a long time practicing it. She wore a dark dress, plain and worn, with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders that was not nearly thick enough for the weather outside. Her hair was dark and pinned back, and her face, when Elias finally looked at it, was the face of someone who had been expecting this moment for a while. Not shocked, not panicked, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "That's your woman?" Denton said, turning to look at her with an expression that made Elias's jaw tighten before he even understood why. She's in my care," Walter said. She's got no family, no money, nobody to go to. But she works hard. She does what she's told. She ain't worth a card bet, Walter, another man at the table said, and the others laughed. The woman did not react. She stood exactly where she was, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes looking at a point on the wall behind the men's heads, and she said nothing. Elias set down his coffee. He didn't make a decision exactly. It was more like something in him that had been sitting very still for a very long time suddenly stood up. She's worth more than anything on this table, Walter insisted, his voice getting louder and more desperate with every word. You take her. She's yours to do with as you see fit. She's quiet. She don't cause trouble. She ain't got any say in it anyway, so it ain't like anyone's going to— Shut your mouth, Elias said. The words came out flat and even, not loud, but the room heard them the way rooms always heard a voice that meant what it said. Everyone turned. Elias walked forward from the back wall. He was not a small man. 9 years on a mountain, working trap lines and hauling timber and surviving conditions that drove most men back to the lowlands, had built him into something that the saloon seemed to notice all at once. He wore a heavy coat, trail-worn and dark with weather, and he moved through the crowd the way a man moves when he's been alone long enough that he's stopped caring about whether other people find him comfortable to be around. He stopped a few feet from Walter's chair. You don't own her, Elias said. Walter blinked. She's in my care, Carter. I've got every right to— You don't own another person, Elias said again, slower this time, like he was explaining something to someone who wasn't very bright. Not here. Not in this town. Not at this table. Nobody asked you to walk over here, Denton said, his voice carrying a warning in it. Elias looked at him for a moment. No, he agreed. They didn't. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the small leather pouch where he kept his travel money. He hadn't planned to spend it tonight. It was meant to cover the cost of his supplies and leave enough to carry him through to spring. He counted out what was inside. It wasn't a lot. He set it on the table in front of Walter. That's what I've got, he said. Every coin. You take it, we're done. She walks out of here with me, and she doesn't come back to you. Walter stared at the money. His lips worked without making sounds for a moment. That doesn't cover what I owe. I know what it covers, Elias said. I'm not paying your debt. I'm buying her freedom from you specifically. What you owe these men is your problem. Denton Cross leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Something moved in his expression that Elias didn't entirely like. Amusement partly, but also something calculating. Let him have her, Denton said to the others with a shrug. Saves us the trouble of figuring out what to do with her anyway. There was laughter around the table, coarse and dismissive, and a few men nearby joined in. Elias didn't look at them. He looked at the woman. She was looking back at him now, for the first time. Her eyes were dark and steady, and she was reading his face with an intensity that caught him off guard, like she was trying to determine in the space of a few seconds whether he was an improvement or simply a different kind of problem. He didn't blame her for the question. I'm Elias Carter, he said. I live up on Kessler Ridge. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not looking for company. But you can't stay here, and you can't stay with him. So if you'll come with me tonight, I'll take you somewhere safe, and we'll figure out the rest in the morning. A long moment passed. The saloon waited. The woman straightened her shawl, lifted her chin exactly 1 degree, and said, My name is Clara Whitfield. It was not a yes. It was not a no. But she picked up the small bag that was sitting at her feet, and when Elias turned toward the door, she followed. The cold outside hit like a closed fist. Clara had no coat beyond the shawl, and Elias saw her pull it tighter the moment they stepped off the saloon's porch and into the full force of the winter night. He stopped, shrugged off the heavy outer layer he wore over his coat, and held it out to her without a word. She looked at it for a moment. I don't need charity, she said. It's 20 degrees, he said, and the nearest shelter beyond this town is 2 hours uphill in the dark. Take the coat, Miss Whitfield. Another pause. Then she took it. He had a horse tied at the post, a big gray named Dutch, steady and reliable on mountain terrain. He untied him and looked back at Clara, who was standing a few feet away in his coat, watching him with those careful, measuring eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "Then you take the horse. I'll walk alongside." She started to object, and he shook his head once. "The shoes you're wearing will be soaked through in 10 minutes in that snow," he said. "You ride." She didn't argue again. She put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up with a steadiness that told him she'd been on a horse before and knew what she was doing. She settled into the saddle without fuss, adjusted the reins, and looked down at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "In the saloon." "No," he said. "I didn't. Most men wouldn't have." "Most men weren't standing in the right place," he said. He clicked for Dutch to move and started up the trail. Or the wrong one, depending on how tonight goes. He thought he heard something that might have been a very small, very contained sound of amusement from behind him. But when he glanced back, her face was perfectly composed, and she was watching the trail ahead the way a person does when they're already calculating what comes next. Elias turned back to the path. He was already regretting the coins on the table. Not because of the money, because he had a feeling. The same feeling he got sometimes in the mountains when the wind shifted and the light changed, and every instinct he'd built over 9 years of wilderness living stood up and paid attention. That he had just walked into something that was going to take considerably longer than one night to walk out of. He kept moving. Behind him, Clara Whitfield rode his horse through the dark and the cold, carrying a small bag and a shawl that wasn't hers, and a past she hadn't told him about yet. The trail wound upward into the mountains. The snow came down soft and relentless, the way it did when it planned to stay. Elias pulled his collar up and watched the path and didn't say anything, because there was nothing yet to say. But Dutch's ears were forward the whole climb, which was what that horse did when he sensed something unusual on the trail ahead. And the horse, in Elias's experience, was rarely wrong. The cabin sat on a shelf of rock halfway up Kessler Ridge, tucked against a stand of pines that broke the wind from the northwest. It was not elegant. It was built for function. Thick log walls, a heavy door, a single window on the south side, a stove that could heat the whole space in under an hour if you fed it right. Elias had built it himself, the winter after he came up to the mountain. He'd been 28 years old and angry at everything and looking for somewhere the noise couldn't reach him. The ridge had given him that. 9 years later, it still did. He had never brought anyone here. He opened the door and went in first, got the stove going, and stepped back to let her through without making a point of it. Clara came inside and stood for a moment, looking around. Not judging. Just taking inventory, the way practical people do when they enter an unfamiliar space. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" 9 years. She nodded slowly, like that answered something she hadn't asked out loud. She moved toward the stove and held her hands out to the warmth, and for the first time that night, some of the rigid control in her face softened just slightly. "There's a shelf up there," Elias said, nodding toward the corner. "Blankets, more than I use. You can take what you need." "Where do I sleep?" He pointed toward the corner opposite the stove where he'd built a low platform bed with a rope-strung frame. "I'll take the floor," he said. She looked at him. "You don't need to do that," she said. "The floor doesn't bother me." "Mr. Carter." "Elias," he said. "And it's fine. Get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning." She studied him for another moment. That careful, quiet appraisal that he was already starting to recognize as something she did when she wasn't sure whether to trust the information in front of her. Then she said, "All right." He rolled out his bedroll near the stove, close enough for warmth, far enough to make it clear there was nothing else intended. He lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind working at the eaves and the soft sound of Clara settling onto the bed across the room. She was quiet. Completely quiet. Most people made noise when they settled in. Shifting, turning. The small sounds of someone getting comfortable in an unfamiliar place. Clara Whitfield made none of them, which meant, Elias understood, that she was lying still and awake and waiting, the way a person does when they've spent a long time sleeping in places where sounds in the dark meant something. He didn't say anything, He just closed his eyes and let the stove tick and the wind push at the cabin walls and the snow come down outside, and eventually, slowly, with the patience of someone who had learned that sleep came when it wanted and not before, he drifted off. Sometime in the deep part of the night, he woke up. The stove had burned low, but the cabin was still warm. The snow had stopped. The wind had gone quiet. He turned his head and looked across the room. Clara was sitting up on the edge of the bed in the dark, not moving, just sitting. Elias lay still. He watched her for a moment, long enough to understand that she wasn't frightened, wasn't in pain, wasn't doing anything in particular. Just sitting there in the dark and the silence, the way someone does when they've come through something and aren't sure yet what's on the other side of it. He understood that feeling. He closed his eyes again and left her to it. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee. He sat up and found Clara standing at the stove with his pot and his grounds, and the careful, efficient movements of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She had found the cups without asking. She had found the water, the grounds, the correct amount of wood to feed the stove. She poured a cup and set it on the small table without looking at him. "You made coffee," he said. "I needed something to do," she said. "And you were asleep." He got up, pulled on his coat, sat down at the table. He looked at the cup. Nobody had made him coffee, and he didn't actually calculate it, but it had been a very long time. "Thank you," he said. It was the first genuinely kind thing he had said to her since they left the saloon. She looked at him then, briefly, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Like a word in a language she'd almost forgotten how to speak. "You're welcome," she said. He drank the coffee. Outside, the ridge was white and clean and completely still. The way the mountain was sometimes after a snow, when the whole world felt like it had been reset, and the trouble of the night before was buried under 2 feet of new silence. But Elias Carter knew better than to trust a mountain that looked peaceful. The same silence that made a place feel safe was the same silence that hid everything that was still out there, moving through the trees, waiting for the right moment. He thought about that feeling he'd had on the trail the night before. He thought about the way Clara Whitfield had stood in that saloon, not like a woman who had been beaten down, but like a woman who had made a deliberate choice to look that way. There was a difference. He had seen enough people in enough desperate situations to know the difference. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked across the cabin at the woman who had slept in his bed and made his coffee and was currently doing something near the supply shelf that looked very much like taking quiet, careful stock of everything stored there. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Clara," she corrected, without turning around. "Clara," he said. "I need to know something." She turned then. "I need to know what I've actually brought home," he said. "Because I've been on this mountain long enough to know when something's not what it's presenting itself as. And you," he paused, measuring the words, "you are not what you were presenting yourself as last night." A long silence. The stove ticked. Outside, a pine branch dropped its load of snow with a soft thud. Clara looked at him for a long time with those dark, steady eyes. Then she said, "What exactly do you think you see, Mr. Carter?" "Elias," he said. "Elias," she repeated. And there was something in the way she said his name. Careful, deliberate, like she was deciding whether to let it mean something. That settled into the cabin like the warmth from the stove. She sat down across the table from him. She put her hands flat on the surface between them, and she looked at him, and she said, "All right, ask me what you want to know." He leaned forward. Outside, the mountain waited. And inside the small cabin on Kessler Ridge, 2 people who had spent a long time surviving alone sat across from each other in the morning light. And the story that had started at a poker table in a saloon on the coldest night of the year began, for the first time, to tell itself honestly. "Why?" Elias said quietly. "Did you let them call you worthless?" Clara looked at the table between them. Then she looked up. "Because worthless people," she said, "don't get hunted." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Elias Carter looked at the woman across the table, and he understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent 9 years reading the mountain for signs of danger, that whatever had followed her to Black Hollow was still out there, and that sooner or later it was going to find Kessler Ridge. Clara's words didn't fade. They expanded, filling every corner of that small cabin the way cold fills a room when the door's been left open too long. Worthless people don't get hunted. Elias sat with that for a moment. He was not a man who rushed to fill silence, and this particular silence had weight to it, the kind that meant whatever came next was going to cost something. "Who's hunting you?" he said. Clara looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up at him, and what he saw in her face was not fear exactly. It was something more disciplined than fear. It was a person who had lived alongside danger long enough to stop being surprised by it, and who was now calculating, carefully and precisely, how much truth it was safe to hand to a stranger. "I don't know how much to tell you," she said. "Tell me enough that I know what direction trouble's coming from," Elias said. "That's all I need right now." She studied him. "You're not afraid." "I've lived on this mountain alone for 9 years," he said. "Fear doesn't go away. You just learn to be useful while it's happening." Something moved in her expression. Not quite trust, but the thing that comes just before trust, when a person is deciding whether the ground they're standing on is solid enough to take a step forward. "There's a man," she said. "His name is Caleb Harlan." Elias didn't react to the name outwardly, but he knew it. Everybody in the Colorado Territory knew it, the way you knew the name of a storm system that had already torn through 3 counties. Not because you'd seen it yourself, but because you'd seen what it left behind. Caleb Harlan ran the largest outlaw operation in the Southern Rockies. Rustling, robbery, extortion, occasionally worse. He had a camp somewhere in the high country that nobody had been able to locate because the men who went looking for it had an unfortunate tendency not to come back. "How do you know Caleb Harlan?" Elias said. Clara's jaw tightened. "He killed my father." The stove ticked. Outside, a bird called once and went quiet. "Tell me," Elias said. And she did. Her father, James Whitfield, had owned a cattle ranch 2 days' ride south of Black Hollow. A real operation. 200 head, good land, solid buildings. A reputation for honest dealing that went back 20 years. Clara had grown up there, educated by her mother until her mother died, then by her father, who believed that a daughter's mind was worth developing the same as a son's. She could read and write and cipher. She understood land records and contracts and the kind of legal documents that most people in the territory treated as mysterious objects best left to lawyers. She also knew livestock, weather, terrain, and how to handle herself in the wilderness. Her father had made sure of that too, because he was a practical man, and the Colorado high country was not a forgiving landscape for anyone who wasn't paying attention. "He came for the land," Clara said. "Harlan. He'd been buying up ranches all across the valley, or taking them when buying didn't work. Some of the owners sold because they were scared. Some of them just disappeared." She paused. "My father didn't scare easily." "What happened?" "They came at night, 4 of them. My father heard them before they got to the house. He always slept light, always had. He got me out through the back window and told me to run for the Henderson place, 3 miles north." Her voice stayed level and controlled, the way a person's voice stays level when they've told a story enough times that the telling of it has become separate from the feeling of it. "I ran. I heard the shots. I kept running because that was what he told me to do, and because stopping wouldn't have changed anything." Elias was quiet. "The Henderson place was empty when I got there," she said. "They'd already been through. I kept moving north. I didn't stop for 2 days." "How old were you?" 19. He looked at her. She was in her mid-20s now, he guessed, which meant she had been running for somewhere between 5 and 6 years. "How did you end up with Harlan?" he said. "I didn't at first. I found work wherever I could. Laundry, cooking, mending. I kept moving so nobody could report back where I was. But Harlan had reach. He had men in towns I didn't even know he had men in." She stopped. "A man named Drew Fossey caught me in a town called Perdido Springs. He worked for Harlan. He said I had a choice, come back with him or he'd tell people what I'd seen the night my father was killed. Could your testimony have hurt Harlan? I'd watched through the window before I ran, she said simply. I saw faces. I saw enough. She paused again. Fossey said if I tried to use what I knew, Harlan would make sure I was the one who got blamed for what happened, that I'd helped plan it, that my father and I had been in a dispute over the land, and I'd arranged it to collect. She said it flatly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. I had no family left, and no money, and no way to prove otherwise, so I went. They kept you. They used me, she corrected. There's a difference. I could read legal documents. I could interpret land grants, property records, county filings. Harlan was running a land fraud operation alongside everything else, forging deeds, backdating transfers, getting ranchers tied up in legal disputes they couldn't afford to fight. He needed someone who understood the paperwork. She looked at Elias steadily. I did understand it. Better than anyone he had. So they kept me close, and they used what I knew, and they made very sure I understood what would happen if I tried to leave. The mark, Elias said quietly. Clara's expression didn't change, but her hands, still flat on the table, pressed down very slightly, like she was steadying herself against something that lived below the surface. They mark the ones they consider property, she said. So if you run, any man who finds you knows who you belong to and knows there's a reward for bringing you back. A long silence. When did you run? Elias said. 4 months ago. I found a window. They sent me into Durango to file some papers. Fossey went with me, but he had business of his own and left me alone for 20 minutes. Something that might have been dark satisfaction crossed her face. 20 minutes was enough. I'd been planning it for 2 years. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I did it. You filed the papers. I filed different papers, she said. Papers that would take Harlan's men a while to untangle. Papers that pointed toward certain county records that I knew would be difficult for him once people started looking. She paused. Then I ran north. I changed my name twice. Ended up in Black Hollow because it was far enough off the main roads that I thought I'd bought myself some time. And Walter Briggs? Her expression shifted. Walter found out who I was about 3 weeks after I arrived. I don't know how. He didn't go to Harlan. At least not right away. I think he was waiting to see if he could get more use out of me himself first. A beat. He was a petty man, small ambitions. He would have gone to Harlan eventually, Elias said. Yes, Clara said. He would have. Elias sat back. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. He looked at the woman across the table from him. This woman who had run for 5 years and hidden in plain sight and let men call her worthless because it was the safest thing to be, and who had sat across from him this morning and told him all of it in a voice as steady as the mountain outside. You're not going to tell me you're sorry for bringing this here, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. I'm not. You walked into it with your eyes open. I walked into a poker game looking for a quiet place to wait out the cold, he said. And now you know. She met his eyes directly. If you want me gone, I'll go. I won't pretend you don't have reason, but I'll need until the snow softens enough to travel, and I'd appreciate whatever supplies you can spare against what I'd owe you later. He looked at her for a long moment. The mountain was quiet. The stove was warm. His coffee cup was empty, and someone had made it for him this morning for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember. You're not going anywhere, he said. Clara blinked. It was the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd seen her do. Why not? She said. Because Harlan's men are between here and wherever you'd go, he said. Because you've been running for 5 years and you're tired, and tired people make mistakes. And because... He stopped, seemed to consider the last part more carefully, then said it anyway. Because you haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not in the habit of sending innocent people out into a Colorado winter because their situation is inconvenient. A beat. My situation, she said carefully, is considerably more than inconvenient. I know, he said. I heard the whole thing. Stay. She stared at him. Then she looked down at the table, and for just a moment, a single, brief, completely undefended moment. Something crossed her face that looked like relief so profound it almost broke through whatever she'd built to contain it. Then she pulled it back. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We've got a lot of winter left." The days that followed moved the way mountain days in deep winter always moved, slow on the surface and complicated underneath. Elias kept his routines because that was how you survived on the ridge, and because routine was the only structure he'd had for 9 years, and he wasn't sure who he was without it. He checked his trap lines. He hauled wood. He tracked the weather and read the snow, and made the small daily decisions that kept a man alive in a place that didn't forgive carelessness. Clara moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency that he hadn't expected, and that he found, as the days went on, to be one of the most unsettling things about her. Not because it was unwelcome, but because he kept catching himself noticing it, and he wasn't used to noticing anything about another person. She organized his supply shelf on the second day. Not intrusively, not in a way that displaced anything important, but in a way that made it immediately apparent that whoever had arranged it before, him, obviously and carelessly, had been doing it wrong. Things he needed regularly moved to the front. Things he needed seasonally went to the back. She found a system in about 40 minutes that he hadn't thought of in 9 years. He didn't say anything about it, but he used the system, and it was better. She repaired a tear in his spare coat that he'd been ignoring since October. She found where he kept the small tools and fixed the latch on the supply box that had been sticking since the first frost. She moved through the space like someone taking quiet, careful ownership of the problems in it. Not in a way that announced itself, but in a way that got things done. On the 4th day, he came in from checking the north trap line to find that she'd taken apart and cleaned his secondary rifle, a .44 Henry that he used as a backup and that he hadn't properly maintained in months. He stopped in the doorway and looked at it laid out on the table in its component parts, clean and correctly ordered. "You know that rifle," he said. She was reassembling it without looking up. Her hands moved through the familiar sequence with a confidence that no one developed without actual practice. Not just watching, not just theoretical knowledge, but real, repeated, hands-on familiarity with the weapon. "My father taught me," she said. He said a woman who couldn't defend herself in the territory was a woman depending on luck. He didn't think much of luck. She seated the barrel correctly and reached for the next piece. He was right. Elias came the rest of the way inside and hung up his coat. "What else did he teach you?" he said. She looked up then. "Why?" "Because I'm starting to get a clearer picture of what Harlan actually had when he had you," he said. "And it's more than a bookkeeper." Clara set the assembled rifle down on the table and was quiet for a moment. "I can track," she said. "Not as well as you, probably, but well enough. I can read terrain. I know how to set a camp that won't be found if you're careful about where you put it. I know how to live in the wilderness for weeks without resupply." She paused. "And I understand the legal structure of land ownership in the Colorado Territory better than most lawyers do, because I spent 2 years reading every document Harlan's operation ran through my hands, and I have a very good memory." "That's a significant set of skills," Elias said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She looked at him directly. "That's why he won't stop looking." The word "won't" landed differently than "didn't." Elias caught it. "You think he already knows where you are?" "I think," she said carefully, "that it's only a matter of time. Black Hollow isn't invisible, and I was there long enough for someone to notice me. Walter Briggs was a liability I knew about. There may be others I don't." She folded her hands on the table. "I bought myself time with the paperwork in Durango, but time runs out." "How long?" "Weeks, maybe. A month if we're fortunate." She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the full measure of what came through your door." Elias was quiet. He sat down across from her. "All right," he said. "Then we use the time we have." "To do what?" she said. "Prepare," he said. He watched something shift in her face. Not relief this time, something more complicated. The expression of a person who has been operating alone and on the defensive for so long, that the concept of having someone in the same direction as them is almost foreign enough to feel like a trick. "You don't have to do this," she said. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," he said, simply and without drama, and he reached for the rifle on the table and set it between them. "Show me what you know. All of it. I'll do the same. If something comes up that ridge, I'd rather we both know what each other's capable of before it gets there." She looked at the rifle. She looked at him. "All right, Elias," she said, and something in the way she said his name that second time, steadier than the first, more settled, like she'd decided the ground was solid enough, made the cabin feel, for the first time, like it might have been built for two people after all. The next several days were different. Not easier exactly, but different. They worked. That was the most accurate word for it. They worked side by side through the short winter days, and they talked. Not about everything, not all at once, but incrementally, the way people talk when they're doing something else at the same time, and conversation becomes a byproduct of proximity rather than a deliberate effort. He learned that she'd been educated formally until she was 14, then self-educated after that from whatever books she could get hold of. He learned that she'd helped her father manage the ranch's books from the time she was 12, and could read a land survey map faster than most trained surveyors. He learned that she had a particular kind of dry humor that surfaced rarely and without warning, usually when something had gone wrong in a way that was too absurd not to acknowledge. The first time he really heard it was on the 6th day, when he came back from the south trapline to find that the coffee pot had boiled completely dry because she'd been reorganizing the supply situation and lost track of the time. The pot was ruined, scorched black on the inside, and smelling like something that would never be clean again. Clara was standing at the stove looking at it with an expression of pure exasperation when he walked in. "I've survived 5 years on the run from one of the most dangerous outlaw operations in the territory," she said, without turning around. "And I killed your coffee pot." Elias looked at the pot. "That pot was already on borrowed time," he said. "It doesn't make it less embarrassing." "Little bit," he agreed. She turned and looked at him, and for just a moment both of them were on the edge of something, and then Clara Whitfield laughed. A real one, quiet and brief, but genuine. And Elias understood that he had just seen something she didn't show often, and that whatever wall she'd been maintaining had a small, human-sized door in it that she'd just briefly opened. He didn't make a point of it. He just went and found his secondary pot and said, "Start over, I'll get the water." But he thought about that laugh for the rest of the day. He didn't examine why. On the 8th day, something changed. Elias had ridden down the north face to check on a section of trapline near the timberline when he found tracks that didn't belong there. He stopped Dutch and sat very still in the saddle and looked at them for a long time. 3 horses. Moving slowly, not in a hurry, which meant they weren't lost. They were looking at something. The tracks went north along the ridge, then doubled back, then went north again, like whoever was riding had been trying to get a better look at something above them. The cabin was above them. Elias turned Dutch around and came back fast. I was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who had spent 9 years being very, very good at reading signs, and every sign he was currently reading said that someone had been on the north face looking for something, and they had found the general location of what they were looking for, and they had left to go get more people. He came through the cabin door moving quickly, and Clara turned from the stove and read his face before he said a word. "How many?" she said. He stopped. 3 sets of tracks, but they've gone for reinforcements." She didn't ask how he knew. She was already moving. "How long do we have?" "If they left before noon and they're riding to Harlan's nearest camp, maybe a day, maybe less if the camp's closer than I think." "Where's the nearest town with a law office?" "Ridgecrest, 40 miles east." "Can we make it in a day?" "In summer, yes. In this snow, maybe 2. She stopped moving, turned to face him. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were doing that calculating thing that he'd come to recognize as Clara working through a problem faster than most people could track. "Then we can't run," she said. "Not both of us, not in this weather." "No," he agreed. "Then we prepare," she said. And she said it back to him using the exact word he had used, and the fact that she said it without any visible fear, with nothing but clarity and the composed determination of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this moment for a long time, made something in Elias Carter's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Everything you know about the approaches to this ridge," she said. "Every way up, every way down, every place a man on horseback can't go, but a man on foot can. All of it. Right now." He sat down at the table. She sat across from him, and he told her everything. They worked through the rest of the day and into the evening, and by the time the fire burned low and the wind came up again off the ridge, they had a plan. It wasn't comfortable and it wasn't safe, but it was real, and it used every piece of knowledge each of them had brought to that table. And when they finally stopped talking, Elias realized they had been sitting across from each other for 6 hours, and it had felt like one. He looked at her. "You're not scared," he said. He didn't mean it as a compliment exactly, more like an observation he was still working out the meaning of. "I'm terrified," she said. "I've been terrified since I was 19 years old. But being terrified and being paralyzed are different things." She looked at him steadily. "You know that. You know exactly what that's like." He did. He didn't say so. But she saw the answer in his face anyway, and she nodded once, like something had been confirmed. "I should sleep," she said. "So should you." "Clara," he said. She stopped. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever comes up that ridge, you are not property. You are not a mark or a debt or something that belongs to anyone. I want you to know that I know that. Whatever else I don't know yet, I know that." The firelight was low, and the cabin was warm, and the mountain was dark outside, and Clara Whitfield stood very still for a long moment and looked at him with an expression that he couldn't fully read because it had too many things in it at once. "Nobody's said that to me in a long time," she said quietly. "I know," he said. She stood there for one more moment, and then she went across the room and lay down, and she was quiet again, the way she was always quiet. Elias banked the stove and lay down and stared at the ceiling. Outside, somewhere on the north face, 3 sets of tracks waited in the dark. And far below, where the trails came together and the road to the southern camps began, Elias was nearly certain he could hear, beneath the wind, beneath the silence of the snow, the distant sound of riders moving in the dark. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. When dawn came, it came gray and still, and carrying the particular quality of light that Elias had learned over 9 years to associate with incoming weather and with change, the kind of light that meant the mountain was holding its breath. He was already at the window when Clara woke. "They're coming," she said from behind him. Not a question. "Not yet," he said. "But today." He turned. "How are you?" She sat up and looked at him and said, without pretense or hesitation, "Ready." He nodded. He believed her. But in the back of his mind, underneath the planning and the preparation and the practical logistics of what was about to happen, a different kind of thought had taken up quiet residence in the last few hours. Not about Harlan's men, or the mountain approaches, or the plan they'd built the night before. About the woman sitting across the room from him, who had survived 5 years alone, and still had enough left in her to sit across a table and figure out how to fight. He'd brought her up the mountain because it was the right thing to do. He was starting to understand that right and necessary weren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrived in the middle of the coldest night of the year, wearing thin shoes and carrying nothing but a small bag and a secret that could burn the whole valley down. He turned back to the window. The gray light was growing. Below on the north face, Dutch raised his head in the lean-to and looked toward the trail. And somewhere in the trees at the bottom of the ridge, something moved. Dutch's warning came first. The horse didn't make noise. He never did when something was genuinely wrong, which was one of the things Elias had come to trust about him over the years. He just went still in a particular way, his ears hard forward, and his whole body holding the kind of attention that meant he'd already decided there was something out there worth paying attention to. Elias was at the window when it happened, and he saw it through the gray morning light. Dutch's posture shifting, locking, pointing toward the lower tree line, like a compass needle, finding north. Get away from the stove, Elias said. Not loud, not panicked, just certain. Clara was already moving before the words were finished. She went low and to the left, toward the wall where the secondary rifle was propped. And she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been mentally rehearsing this exact moment for a long time. She took the rifle, checked the load in one smooth sequence of motions, and positioned herself below the window line on the cabin's south wall. She did not ask what to do next. That told Elias everything. He took his position at the north window, his own rifle up, and they waited. The trees at the bottom of the ridge were dark and still. Then they weren't. 4 riders came out of the timber moving at a walk, not fast, not cautious, just deliberate. The kind of pace that said, "We know where we're going, and we're not worried about who sees us coming." Elias counted them twice. 4. 4 riders, he said quietly. "I see them," Clara said from across the room. "You recognize any of them from this distance?" A pause. "The one on the left," she said. "Broad shoulders, black hat. That's Drew Fossey." Fossey, the man who had caught her in Perdido Springs. The man who had given her the choice between coming back to Harlan or being blamed for her own father's murder. Elias felt something cold and focused settle into him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "He's Harlan's right hand," Clara said. "I know what he is," Elias said. "Which means Harlan sent his best. Which means Harlan is serious." "He was always going to be serious," Elias said. "A man doesn't mark people and then let them walk away. His whole operation depends on people believing he doesn't." The riders stopped about 200 yards down the slope and sat there, looking up at the cabin. Not advancing, not retreating. Just looking, the way men look at something they've already decided belongs to them and are simply deciding the most efficient way to collect it. Then one of them raised a hand and waved it. An almost casual gesture, like flagging down a neighbor on a road. "That would be Fossey signaling he knows we're watching," Clara said. "He wants us to know they're not here to sneak up on us," Elias agreed. "Why?" "Because he's done this before," Elias said. "He knows that when people know they're being watched, they get nervous. And nervous people make mistakes." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong." "No," Elias said. "He's not." He stepped back from the window. "That's why we're not going to be nervous." One of the 4 riders detached from the group and came forward alone, still at a walk. He stopped 30 yards from the cabin door and sat in the saddle with both hands visible, which was either a genuine gesture of non-aggression or a performance of one. And Elias had been in the mountains long enough to know that the difference mattered enormously. "Carter!" The voice was big and carried well in the cold air. That was Fossey. Elias could see now that it was the man on the left, the broad-shouldered one Clara had identified. "Elias Carter, we don't have a quarrel with you. We just want the woman." Elias moved to the door. He didn't open it. He spoke through the heavy wood at a volume he knew would carry. "She's not here," he said. A beat. "Carter," Fossey said, and his voice stayed pleasant, which was somehow worse than if it had been threatening. "We tracked her to Black Hollow, and we tracked the both of you up that ridge. I've got your boot prints and her shoe prints in the snow going up and no prints coming down. So let's not waste each other's morning." "Maybe the snow covered them," Elias said. "Maybe," Fossey agreed. "But I don't think so." Another pause. "Look, we've got no fight with you. You did a kind thing, taking her in out of the cold. That's a decent impulse. But she's Harlan's business, and Harlan's business has a way of being everybody's business when it doesn't get resolved." He let that land. "I'm asking you to be smart. Open that door, send her out, and we ride away, and you go back to your trap lines and your mountain and your life. Simple as that." Elias looked across the cabin at Clara. She was watching him. Her face was absolutely composed, controlled, measured, giving nothing away. But her eyes were doing that calculating thing, reading the situation through the walls with information she'd gathered over years of surviving exactly this kind of encounter. He lifted his chin slightly in a question. She shook her head once. He turned back to the door. "I don't think that's how this works," Elias said. A pause. "And why's that?" Fossey said. Because you just described the terms of a threat, Elias said. And I don't negotiate with threats. That's a rule I've had for a long time, and I find it keeps things honest. A longer pause this time. When Fosse spoke again, the pleasantness in his voice had thinned slightly, like ice that was still solid but had begun to show its limits. She's marked, Carter, he said. You've seen the mark. You know what it means. That mark means she belongs to Harlan's organization, and anybody who takes her in is taking on Harlan's interest in her. That's not a threat. That's a legal claim. Clara made a sound from across the room that was very brief and very controlled, but contained an entire verdict on the concept of Caleb Harlan having legal claims on anything. A brand isn't a deed, Elias said, and a deed isn't slavery. This is 1882, Fosse, and this is American soil. She's a free woman, and she stays that way. The silence that followed was longer than the previous ones. Elias used it. He stepped back from the door and moved quickly to the north window, angling to look down the slope without exposing himself. The three remaining riders had spread out while Fosse was talking. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but they had moved, east and west along the slope, creating a wider angle of approach to the cabin. They're positioning, he said quietly. How far out? Clara said, moving to see. Still far enough that they're not in range, but they're not staying where they were. He was buying time, Clara said. Yes, Elias said. He's good at that. Carter! Fosse again, louder this time, a different quality in the voice. Last chance to make this simple. Elias didn't respond. Clara crossed to his side of the cabin quickly and looked out the window beside him. Her shoulder was close to his arm. He could feel the steadiness in her, the way you feel the stillness of someone who has made their decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. The East Rider is closest to the woodpile, she said, low and quick. If he gets behind it, he's got cover within 40 yards. She was right. Elias had already seen it. The plan, he said. The plan still works, she said. We just need to execute it while we still have the angle. She looked at him. Do you trust me? It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, and he answered it the same way. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Then I go out the south window like we planned. I circle the long way around to the east approach. I'll have the angle on whoever comes up that side from the woodpile. If they see you moving, they won't, she said. I know how to move in snow without being seen. Fosse taught me that, ironically, along with everything else they used me for. Something moved in her expression. Not bitterness exactly, more like a person noting a fact that has complicated edges. Give me 8 minutes to get into position. Then you give Fosse his answer and draw their attention to the front. He looked at her. 8 minutes was a long time. A lot could go wrong in 8 minutes on a snow-covered mountain ridge with 4 armed men who were already moving into position. Clara, he said. Elias, she said back. And her voice was steady and sure and carried no request in it, only readiness. He let out a slow breath. 8 minutes, he said. Don't be late. I'm never late, she said. And she moved to the south window and went through it without another word, quick and low and almost soundless, disappearing into the white. The 8 minutes were the longest of Elias Carter's life. He stood at the north window and watched the 3 spread-out riders and tracked their movement with the focused patience of a man who had spent 9 years waiting out the mountain's long silences and had learned that impatience was just fear wearing a different coat. Fosse had pulled his horse back to rejoin the group. They were conferring, heads together, which meant they were deciding something, and that the talking phase of this encounter was probably close to its end. 6 minutes. The East Rider had moved again. He was angling toward the woodpile. Clara had called it exactly right. 7 minutes. Elias picked up the Henry and checked it again out of habit, not because he expected to find it different from what it had been 2 minutes ago, but because the act of checking steadied his hands. 8 minutes. I went to the front door. He pulled it open and stepped out onto the cabin's small porch, rifle held visible but pointed down, and he looked directly at Fosse across the slope. Fosse turned his horse. There he is, Fosse said. Changed your mind? Not even slightly, Elias said. but I figure if we're going to have this conversation, we might as well have it where I can hear you clearly. Where's the woman, Carter? Not your concern, Elias said. Fosse's pleasant expression, finally, fully dissolved. You're making a very serious mistake. I've made a few of those, Elias said. They generally turn out better than people expect. He was watching the East Rider as he said it. The man had reached the woodpile and was dismounting, which put him on the ground and behind cover, exactly where he wanted to be, and exactly where he had just made his worst decision of the morning. Because the sound that came from the east side of the ridge was the distinctive metallic sound of a rifle being leveled, and the voice that came with it was calm and clear and carried no tremor whatsoever. Drop the rifle, Clara said. Both hands out to the sides, right now. The man at the woodpile froze. Fosse's horse shied at the unexpected voice. The other two riders started to move, and Elias brought his rifle up to his shoulder. I wouldn't, he said, and something in his voice apparently communicated that he meant it, because they stopped. A silence fell over the ridge that was different from the silence before, fuller, more loaded, containing the weight of a confrontation that had just fundamentally shifted. Fosse looked from Elias to the east side of the cabin where Clara's voice had come from, and something moved in his face that Elias read as a man recalculating rapidly. You've got one man, Fosse said, his voice carrying an effort at steadiness. We've got 4. You had 4, Clara said from her position. The man at the woodpile is now mine. You've got 3. A pause. Do you want to keep going with the arithmetic, Mr. Fosse? I'm very good at it. The man at the woodpile dropped his rifle. He put his hands out to the sides. Fosse stared at the spot where Clara's voice was coming from, and Elias could see the moment the recalculation finished because the man's expression changed. From threat to something harder to categorize, something that contained a question Elias knew Fosse hadn't expected to be asking on this particular morning. You didn't think she could do this, Elias said quietly. Fosse looked at him. None of you did, Elias said. That was your mistake. Not riding up here. Not the 4-2 arithmetic. The mistake was thinking she was what you needed her to be instead of what she actually is. A beat. Fosse said nothing. Leave, Elias said. Take your men and ride south. Don't come back to this ridge. Harlan won't accept this, Fosse said. His voice had gone flat, stripped of the pleasantness, stripped of the threat, down to just the bare fact of what he believed. Harlan can come himself, Elias said. If he wants to have this conversation personally, I'll be here. Fosse looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked again toward where Clara's voice had come from. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working through something that hadn't resolved yet. And then he made a sound that might have been a short, humorless acknowledgement of something he hadn't expected. He turned his horse. Ride, he said to the others. The man at the woodpile picked up his rifle. He reached for it slowly and looked toward Clara's position, and she said, Leave it. And he left it, and remounted and followed Fosse south. The other two came together and fell in behind, and within 2 minutes, all 4 horses were back in the timber and then gone, the sound of their movement dissolving into the white silence of the ridge. Clara came around the east corner of the cabin. She was moving fast, not running but close to it, rifle up and eyes on the tree line. She came to the porch and stood beside Elias, and they both watched the direction the riders had gone for a full minute without speaking. Then she lowered the rifle. They'll be back, she said. Yes, he said. With more men. Yes, he said again. She turned and looked at him. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her hair had come loose on one side, and her eyes were very bright in the gray morning light, and she was breathing fast from the movement and the tension of the last few minutes. She looked, Elias thought, like exactly who she was. Not the woman from the saloon who had stood still and let the world decide what she was worth. The one underneath that, the one who had survived 5 years on the run and learned every skill she needed and executed a plan on a snow-covered mountain ridge with precision and nerve and zero hesitation. You were good out there, he said. She looked startled by the compliment. Just briefly, just a flash of something undefended. I had good positioning, she said. You had good positioning, he agreed. And you were good. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back toward the door. We need to think about what comes next. Fosse will report back within the day. Whatever Harlan sends the second time will be different from this. I know, Elias said. He followed her inside. Sit down, let's think. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. The stove was still going, and the cabin was warm, and the abandoned rifle lay against the woodpile outside. And for a moment, just a single suspended moment, neither of them said anything. Then Clara put her hands flat on the table. That gesture he was starting to recognize as her way of centering herself, and said, "The problem is not just the men. The problem is the legal structure Harlan has built around this." "The land fraud," Elias said. "More than that," she said. "Harlan has connections inside the county administration. 2 county commissioners in his pocket, maybe more. The county clerk in Ridgecrest is a man named Ord Finley. He processes every land transfer in the Eastern Territory, and he's been filing documents for Harlan for at least 3 years. She looked at Elias. "I know this because I prepared some of those documents myself, before I understood what I was actually doing, before I started looking more carefully." "What did you find when you looked more carefully?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, like she was deciding something. Then she said, "I found the original deed to my father's ranch." Elias went still. "The real one," she said. "Not the forged transfer that Harlan filed after my father's death. The original. The one my father recorded with the Territorial Land Office in 1861. I found it in Harlan's own files, which tells you how thorough he was about collecting evidence against himself." Her voice was careful and very controlled. "He kept it because he's careful. He kept everything. Evidence of what he did. Evidence of what he owns. Evidence of what he can prove and what he can disprove. He's organized. I'll give him that. And you?" "I copied it," she said. "While I was still with them, before I ran. I copied the deed and several other documents that were relevant to what Harlan had done in the valley over the past 10 years, and I put those copies somewhere safe." She paused. "And when I filed those papers in Durango before I ran, I didn't just create problems for Harlan's current operation. I filed a formal claim on my father's ranch, in my name, with the original deed number and the original recording date attached." Elias looked at her. "You filed a legal claim on your father's land while you were supposed to be filing Harlan's documents," he said slowly. "In the same trip, at the same office." She held his gaze steadily, while Fosse was 3 streets away at a card game. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's what he's actually after." "Yes," she said. "It's not just about the mark. It's not even really about controlling me, though he wants that too. If my claim on the Whitfield ranch goes through, and if the original deed is certified, it will go through, because my father's recording was legitimate and Harlan's transfer was forged. Then the entire legal structure he's built on top of that land falls apart. And if that falls apart, the other ranches fall too," Elias said. "One by one," she said. "Because I have documentation of the pattern. I didn't just copy my father's deed. I copied evidence of 8 other transfers that followed the same method, the same forged language, the same backdated witnesses." She paused. "If that documentation reaches the right people, Caleb Harlan doesn't just lose some land. He faces federal charges." The word federal landed in the cabin with a weight that both of them felt. Elias stared at the table for a moment. "Where are the copies?" he said. "Not here," she said. "I'm not foolish enough to carry them on my person. They're in a safe location in Ridgecrest." "With who?" She looked at him carefully. "A lawyer. A man named Aldous Marsh, who was a friend of my father's. I sent them ahead of me when I left Durango, with a letter explaining what they were and what to do with them if I didn't arrive within 60 days. She paused. "I've got about 3 weeks left on that 60 days. The full shape of it assembled itself in Elias's mind. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before a lawyer in Ridgecrest either received Clara Whitfield in person or opened a letter and did something with evidence that could bring down Caleb Harlan's operation, and which would, if Harlan learned about it first, put that lawyer and everyone connected to him in serious danger." "You planned all of this," Elias said, "before you ran. I planned it for 2 years before I ran, she said. Every detail, every contingency I could think of. A pause. I didn't plan on Walter Briggs figuring out who I was. I didn't plan on a poker game. She looked at him. I didn't plan on you. No, he said. I'd imagine not. You changed the timeline, she said. Not in a bad way, but it changed things. Because now Harlan knows you're here, he said. Because now Harlan knows I'm here, she agreed. And because Fosse will tell him about this morning, and Harlan is smart enough to understand what this morning means. I'm not just hiding anymore. I've got protection, I've got a position, and I've clearly got enough nerve left to use both. She paused. Which means he won't wait. He'll come at this hard and fast, and he'll bring enough men to make it overwhelming. How many? As many as it takes, she said. He doesn't do things halfway. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We need to get you to Ridgecrest. With Harlan's men between us and the road. Yes. In the snow. Yes. With potentially less than 48 hours before he sends the next group. Yes, Elias said. All of that. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved. Not fear, and not defeat, but a kind of very deep tiredness. The kind that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally feeling the full weight of it all at once. Elias, she said quietly. I know, he said. If this goes wrong, it won't. If it does, she said, I need you to know something. What you said to me last night, what you said about the mark and about being free. She stopped. I've been called a lot of things in the last 5 years. Useful, dangerous, property, liability. Nobody's called me free. She paused. You did. He looked at her. You are, he said. She pressed her lips together briefly and looked at the table. Then she straightened, and when she looked up, her face had that clear, resolved quality that he was starting to understand was Clara at her most herself. Not performing strength, not suppressing fear, just being exactly as capable as she actually was. Then let's go to Ridgecrest, she said. He nodded. We leave in an hour, he said. Take only what we need. We go northeast first, up toward the high ridge, so we're above any approach from the south. Then we come down the backside of the mountain and pick up the eastern road. Fosse will expect us to go east, she said. Fosse expects us to stay put, Elias said. He expects us to be defensive. He's going to ride back to wherever Harlan's nearest camp is and spend 2 or 3 hours reporting and regrouping. That's our window. And if the window is shorter than we think? Then we handle it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You sound very certain for a man who just told 4 armed men to leave his mountain this morning, she said. 3, he said. You had the 4th one. Something moved in her face. That almost laugh, the brief one, the human-sized door in the wall she kept between herself and the world. 3, she agreed. He stood up. Pack what you need, he said. I'll get Dutch ready. She stood too, and there was a moment, just a moment, where they were both standing at the table in the small warm cabin, and the weight of what the next 24 hours were going to require was right there between them, visible and real and not small. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. I've been thinking about that since last night. I don't know the right words. Don't thank me, he said. Just get to Ridgecrest and do what you came to do. She nodded. She turned toward the supply shelf. And Elias turned toward the door, and he paused there for just a second with his hand on the latch, because something had occurred to him in the last 30 seconds that he hadn't fully registered until right now. Something about the way it felt to be standing in his cabin with another person, planning something together, moving toward something instead of just surviving in place. He had lived on this mountain for 9 years. He had believed, with complete conviction, that solitude was a choice and not a loss. He was starting to revise that understanding. He pushed open the door and went out into the cold to saddle his horse. Behind him, Clara moved through the cabin with her particular quiet efficiency, and the sounds she made, small, practical, purposeful, were already starting to feel like something the silence had been missing. The hour passed fast. They were moving before it finished. The northeast approach to the high ridge was brutal in snow, and Elias knew it and took it anyway, because brutal and survivable were different things, and he had the experience to tell them apart. He led Dutch by the reins on the steeper sections, giving Clara the saddle for the difficult terrain, and he pushed the pace because the window was real, and he knew it, and he was not willing to waste a single minute of it. Clara didn't complain. She kept up without being asked to. On the section where the trail narrowed and the footing got technical, she watched his feet and matched his movements with a precision that told him she'd navigated difficult terrain before and knew that the way to do it was to pay attention and commit. They were halfway up the northeast face when she said, "Someone's moving on the south trail." He stopped, turned. She was looking back down the mountain, her eyes narrowed against the light. "How many?" he said. "I can't tell yet," she said. "But it's not a single rider." Elias looked. Below them, on the south approach, the approach Fosse had used that morning, there was movement in the tree line. Not 4 riders this time. More than 4. He did the calculation quickly. If Harlan's nearest camp was close enough, if Fosse had been closer than Elias estimated when he came to the ridge that morning, then Fosse hadn't needed 2 or 3 hours to regroup. He'd needed 1. "They're faster than I thought," Elias said. "Yes," Clara said. She was already looking up the remaining slope toward the high ridge. "How far to the top?" 20 minutes in good conditions," he said. 30 in this snow." "And the other side?" "Once we're over the ridge, we're on the eastern slope. Harlan's men would have to cross the summit to follow us or circle all the way around the south end of the mountain. Either way, we gain significant ground." "Then we run," she said. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without hesitation, just as a statement of what needed to happen next. He pulled Dutch forward. They ran. The summit of Kessler Ridge on a winter morning was not a place that encouraged prolonged stops. The wind came off the high country with a ferocity that was almost impersonal. Not cruel, just absolute. The way the mountain was when it stopped pretending to accommodate human beings and reminded them of what it actually was. They crossed the summit without stopping and started down the eastern face, and as they moved, Elias glanced back once toward the south approach. The riders were visible now, past the tree line, moving up the slope. He counted quickly. 8 men. Caleb Harlan had not sent 4 this time. He had sent 8, which meant Fosse had been much closer to a camp than Elias had calculated, and which meant Harlan had already been moving before Fosse even reported back, which meant he knew, Clara said from the saddle. She had seen the same thing. He was already coming. Fosse's report this morning was just confirmation. "He knew you were here before this morning," Elias said. "Before last night," she said quietly. "He knew I was in Black Hollow. He was already moving when Fosse went up the ridge." A pause. Walter didn't wait to sell the information. He sold it immediately, probably the same night. The same night Elias had walked into the saloon. The same night he'd put his coins on the table. The sequence laid itself out in his mind with an unpleasant clarity. Walter Briggs had already contacted Harlan or Harlan's people before that poker game. The poker game hadn't been about debt at all. It had been about getting Clara out of the saloon before Harlan's men arrived to collect her, and keeping his own hands clean in the process. If someone else took her out of the saloon, Walter's debt to Harlan's organization was paid without Walter having to physically hand a woman over. Elias had been a convenient exit, and now 8 men were coming over Kessler Ridge behind them because of it. "Does that change your thinking?" Clara said. She was watching his face. "About what?" he said. "About any of this." Her voice was careful. "About me. About what you walked into." He looked at her. "No," he said. She held his gaze. "I walked into it with my eyes open," he said, using the same words she'd used back at the cabin that first morning. "I know that doesn't make it easier." "It doesn't," she said, "but it matters." She glanced back up the ridge. "We need to move." He turned Dutch east, and they went down the slope, and the 8 riders were behind them on the mountain, and Ridgecrest was 40 miles of winter road ahead, and the 60-day clock on Aldous Marsh's letter had 21 days left on it. And somewhere in Elias Carter's chest, underneath everything else, was the recognition that the 9 years of solitude he'd spent believing he was exactly where he should be had just, definitively and permanently, ended. He kept moving. So did Clara. Below them, the eastern valley opened up white and wide and cold in the gray winter light, and the road to Ridgecrest cut through it like a dark thread. They had a head start. For now. The eastern road was nothing like the mountain trails Elias knew by instinct and by heart. It was wide enough for a wagon and hard-packed under the snow, which meant Dutch could move at a real pace instead of the careful picking steps the ridge demanded. But it also meant that anyone following them had the same advantage. Elias kept one eye on the road ahead and one on the back trail, and Clara rode without needing to be told to watch the same thing. They didn't talk for the first hour. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said for them. 8 men. A 40-mile road. 21 days on a clock in Ridgecrest that didn't know what was happening up on Kessler Ridge and couldn't adjust itself to accommodate it. It was Clara who broke the silence, and she did it practically. "They can't maintain that pace through deep snow," she said, looking back over her shoulder. 8 riders make a wider trail and heavier going. We're 1 horse and 2 people. We're lighter and faster on the descent. "For now," Elias said. "Once we're on flat ground, it evens out. Then we need to be off flat ground before they catch up to us." She looked at the road ahead. "Are there settlements between here and Ridgecrest?" 2, he said. "Harlow's Crossing at about 16 miles out, then a place called Denton Springs about 10 miles past that." "Harlow's Crossing, what's there?" "Trading post, a few families, a livery, maybe 40 people in total." She thought about that. If Harlan has reach in that direction— "I don't know his reach east of the mountain," Elias said. "I've been on the ridge. I don't know who owes him favors out here." "We assume everyone until proven otherwise," she said. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him. "You're not arguing with my assessment." "Your assessment is correct," he said. "Why would I argue with it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Most men would," she said. "Most men in your position would be telling me to let them do the thinking." "Most men in my position haven't spent the last 12 hours watching you think," he said. "I know what I'm working with." She turned away, back to the road, but he caught the edge of her expression before she did, and it was that thing again, the barely there reaction of a person who keeps receiving something they'd stopped expecting. He kept Dutch moving. The cold was serious. Not the killing kind, not yet, but the persistent kind that worked at exposed skin and made the muscles in the hands stiffen around reins and rifle stocks. Elias had dressed for the mountain that morning, and Clara was still wearing his heavy outer coat, which was the right decision, and he didn't revisit it. At the 2-hour mark, he pulled Dutch off the road without explanation, and Clara followed his lead without asking why, which he was grateful for because the why was a sound, very faint, in the trees to the south, that he wasn't certain of yet and didn't want to voice until he was. They sat still in the pines for 4 minutes. The sound resolved itself into wind working through branches. Nothing else. He put Dutch back on the road. Clara settled back into the saddle and exhaled slowly through her nose. "False alarm?" she said. "Wind," he said. "You're not sure." "I'm sure enough," he said. "We keep moving." She accepted that. It was somewhere near the 3-hour mark when Elias noticed Dutch's ears shift. The same way they'd shifted in the lean-to that morning, hard forward and locked, the horse finding something specific in the noise around them and pointing at it. Elias slowed without stopping. "Single rider," he said, low. "Ahead of us. Maybe a 1/4 mile." Clara straightened in the saddle. "Ahead," she said. "Not behind." "Ahead," he confirmed. "A beat." "They sent someone around," she said. The words came out flat and precise, containing their implications without dramatizing them. "While Fosse came up the south face, someone rode the long way east, to cut us off on the road." "That's how I read it," Elias said. "Then they planned this before this morning," she said. "This wasn't a response to what happened on the ridge. This was already in motion." "Harlan doesn't improvise," she had told him, back in the cabin. And now the shape of it was clear. 4 men up the south face as the visible threat, 8 men following close behind, and at least 1 more ahead on the eastern road. Layers. The way a man set a trap when he was very serious about what he was catching. "How do you want to do this?" Elias said. Clara looked at the road ahead. Her jaw was set and her eyes were moving, reading the terrain by what she knew of it rather than what she could see. "If it's one rider, he's a scout," she said. "His job is to confirm our direction and signal back. He won't engage alone." She paused. "If we take him off the road before he can signal, we buy time." "Can you ride fast enough to come up on him before he hears us?" Elias said. "Through this snow?" She looked down at the road surface. "If we stay to the left where the drifting is deeper, yes. It muffles the hoofbeats." He looked at her. "You'll need to come up on his left side so he can't draw across his body." "I know which side to come up on," she said, in a tone that was not unkind, but that made clear this was not her first rodeo, as the expression went. "Go," he said. She clicked Dutch forward and angled left onto the deeper snow along the tree line, and the horse's hoofbeats went from the sharp percussion of packed trail to the soft compression of powder, and within 20 seconds they were moving faster but quieter, and the road was a pale strip on their right, and the trees were dark on their left, and there was nothing to do but commit. Elias moved with her, rifle loose in his hands, watching the road ahead. The scout came into view around a long bend. A single rider sitting still on a gray horse, turned half sideways, looking back the way he'd come. Looking for them, probably. Waiting for confirmation that they were on this road. He heard them at the same moment they came fully into view, which was 2 seconds too late. Clara pushed Dutch from canter to full run in one stride. The scout's horse shied at the sudden approach, and he grabbed for the reins with both hands, which was the natural human response and the wrong tactical one. And by the time he had the horse under control and reached for the rifle on his saddle, Clara was alongside him, and Elias was 6 feet behind with his own rifle raised. "Don't," Elias said. The scout was young, younger than Elias had expected. 20, maybe 22, with a face that was trying very hard to look unfrightened and not quite managing it. He looked at Elias's rifle, then at Clara, then back at Elias. He took his hand off his rifle. "Smart," Elias said. "Now, who sent you?" "Nobody," the boy said. "Try again," Clara said. Her voice was level and precise, and she was watching him with a steadiness that was, Elias could see, considerably more unnerving to the young man than the rifle. "I work for Mr. Harlan," the scout said, after a short pause. "What were your instructions?" Clara said. Another pause. The young man looked at her with an expression that was complicated, part fear, part something that looked almost like surprise, like he hadn't expected the woman to be the one asking questions. "Watch the road," he said. "Signal when I saw you." "Signal how?" Elias said. "Fire," he said. 3 shots up." Elias looked at Clara. "He hasn't fired yet," she said. "No," the scout agreed. "You came up quiet." "Then nobody behind us knows where we are," Elias said. He looked at the young man steadily. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me your rifle, your sidearm, and your signal flare if you've got one. Then you're going to ride south, not west, not back toward that group behind us. South. And you're going to keep riding south until you reach a town, and then you're going to get off that horse and go inside somewhere warm, and think very carefully about what kind of men you want to spend your life working for." The young man stared at him. "I'll tell Mr. Harlan," he started. "You'll tell him whatever you want," Elias said. "But you'll tell him from somewhere that isn't this road, and we'll be in Ridgecrest before it matters." He kept his voice level and without particular heat. "I'm not going to hurt you. You look like a kid who needed work and took what was available. That's a circumstance, not a character. Go find better circumstances." A long silence. The young man looked at Clara again. She looked back at him. "He means it," she said. "And so do I." He handed over the rifle, then the sidearm. He didn't have a flare. Elias had suspected as much. The boy was too young and too lightly outfitted to be anything more than a forward observer. He turned his horse south, and for a moment he looked back at the two of them on the road. "She worth all this?" he said to Elias. It wasn't belligerent. It sounded genuinely curious, the question of a young man trying to understand the mathematics of what he was watching. Elias didn't look at Clara when he answered. "She's worth considerably more than this," he said. "Ride." The boy rode. Clara was quiet, as Elias put the extra weapons in the saddlebag. He couldn't see her face clearly, but he could feel the quality of the silence. The same loaded quality it had in the cabin when she'd received something she wasn't prepared for. "You didn't have to say that," she said finally. "It's true," he said. "Come on. We've got 12 miles to Harlow's Crossing and a better road once we get past the switchback." She clicked Dutch forward, and they moved. And for a while, neither of them said anything. But the silence was different now from what it had been in the first hours of the ride. Less tactical, more interior, like two people who had just been through something together and were each, privately, figuring out what it had added up to. It was Clara who spoke first, and she spoke to the road ahead rather than to him directly, which was, Elias had learned, the way she addressed things that mattered to her. "My father used to say that a person's character showed up most clearly, not in what they planned to do, but in what they did when the plan ran out," she said. "He said planning was easy because you got to be heroic in your own head. But when the moment came and the plan was gone, that was when you found out who you actually were." Elias considered that. "He sounds like he was a smart man," he said. "How was?" she said. "He was also wrong sometimes. He thought being honest and principled was sufficient protection against men who weren't." A pause. "It isn't." "No," Elias said. "It isn't." "But you can be honest and principled and also prepared," she said. "That's what he didn't factor in." She was quiet for a moment. "That's what I spent 2 years figuring out." They reached Harlow's Crossing just past midday. It was not much of a place. A trading post, a livery, a handful of buildings scattered along a creek bed, smoke rising from 2 or 3 chimneys. Maybe 40 people, as Elias had said. The kind of settlement that minded its own business, because that was the most practical approach to staying alive in the territory. Elias pulled Dutch up outside the trading post and looked at Clara. "We need to change the horse," he said. "Dutch has been on the road since before dawn, and he's got another 12 miles to do after this. I know a man here who'll do a straight swap and ask no questions." "What's his name?" Clara said. "Abel Marsh," he said. Clara went still. "Marsh?" "Yes." Elias looked at her. "Why?" "The lawyer in Ridgecrest," she said slowly. "Aldous Marsh." A beat. "Abel and Aldous," Elias said. "Brothers," she said, her voice very quiet. "Aldous told me about his brother when I last wrote to him. He said Abel settled at Harlow's Crossing 3 years ago." She looked at Elias. "He never mentioned what kind of man Abel was." "Honest," Elias said. "And careful. He minds his own business, but he keeps track of things." He paused. "Does this change something?" Clara looked at the trading post for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "Let's go inside." Abel Marsh was a man in his late 50s with a gray beard and the hands of someone who had spent decades doing practical things with them. He came out from behind the counter when Elias walked in and extended his hand and said, "Carter, you're off the mountain early." "Circumstances," Elias said. He shook the hand. "I need a horse, something that can do 12 miles at a decent pace. Dutch needs the rest." Abel looked at him. Then he looked at Clara, who had come in behind Elias. Something moved in Abel's expression. Something that looked like recognition. "Miss Whitfield," he said. Elias turned to look at Clara. Clara was looking at Abel Marsh with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not alarm exactly, but its close neighbor. "You know who I am," she said. "My brother wrote to me," Abel said. He said it simply, without drama. He said a woman named Clara Whitfield sent him certain documents and a letter, and that if anyone matching her description came through Harlow's Crossing, I should render whatever assistance I could. He looked at her steadily. His words were, "Help her without hesitation, because she is carrying something that matters." The trading post was quiet. Outside, a gust of wind crossed the creek. Clara put her hand on the counter to steady herself. Just briefly, just one steadying press of the palm, the first genuinely shaken gesture Elias had seen from her. "He received the documents," she said. "He wrote to me the day they arrived," Abel said. "That was 6 weeks ago. And the contents?" "He's spoken to 2 federal men," Abel said quietly. "Riders out of Denver. I don't know the details. He doesn't put details in letters to me for obvious reasons, but he said things were moving." He paused. "He also said he was worried about you, that the 60 days were almost up and you hadn't arrived." Clara pressed her palm against the counter again and looked at the surface of it. "Things became complicated," she said. "I imagine so," Abel said. He looked at Elias. "Is there pursuit?" "8 men behind us on the ridge," Elias said. "They'll reach this road within a few hours, and Harlan may have more people east of here. I don't know his reach in this direction." Abel nodded slowly. He turned and went to the window and looked out for a moment, and when he turned back, his expression was decided. "You'll take my fastest horse," he said to Elias. "Bay mare, 4 years old, strong in the legs. She'll do 12 miles in under 2 hours on this road." He looked at Clara. "And you'll carry something to my brother." He went behind the counter and opened a box and came back with a sealed envelope. "I've been holding this for 2 weeks. He needs it regardless of what else is happening." Clara took the envelope. She looked at Abel Marsh. "Why are you doing this?" she said. It was not an ungrateful question. It was the question of a woman who had learned to understand what things cost people and who didn't accept generosity without knowing its weight. Abel looked at her for a long moment. "My brother was your father's friend," he said. "I knew James Whitfield. Not well, but enough. He was a good man." A pause. "I don't do enough things that are good. This one I can do." He looked at Elias. "I'll have the mare ready in 10 minutes. Take some food from the back. Don't stop at Denton Springs. There's a man there named Curl who has allegiances I don't trust." 10 minutes later, they were back on the road. The bay mare moved like her reputation promised. Smooth and fast and willing. The kind of horse that made 40 miles feel like a manageable problem instead of an impossible one. Clara rode her without the hesitation she'd had on Dutch's unfamiliar saddle in those first days on the mountain, and Elias rode alongside on Dutch, who was, in fact, not as tired as he'd let Abel believe, but who Elias had given the excuse to in order to provide Clara with the better horse. She figured that out before they'd ridden 3 miles. "Dutch is fine," she said, watching the horse. "He's not laboring." "He's carrying more weight," Elias said. "He's carrying less weight than the mare," she said. "You weigh more than I do by a significant margin." A pause. "You gave me the better horse." "The mare's better on flat road," he said. "Elias." He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was tired and steady, and something else that he didn't have an immediate name for. Something that lived on the far side of gratitude, in a place that was quieter and more permanent. "Thank you," she said. "The road's getting icier," he said. "Watch the mare's footing on the turns." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to stop thanking you, and you're going to stop deflecting, and we're going to figure out later what to do with all of that." He looked at the road ahead. "Later," he agreed. They bypassed Denton Springs the way Abel had suggested, cutting north of the road through open country that cost them time, but not safety. And when they came back down onto the Ridgecrest Road, they were on the home stretch. 12 miles of increasingly settled land. The snow thinning as the elevation dropped, the road better kept and more recently traveled. Elias started to let himself believe they were going to make it. Which was, of course, the exact moment the situation changed. They heard the riders before they saw them, coming up fast behind from the west, which meant someone had ridden hard to get ahead of the 8 men on the ridge and had succeeded. 2 horses, moving at a pace that said they were pushing and didn't care who heard them. Clara looked back. Elias looked back. "Not 8, she said. "No," he said. "2. Foci," she said. And she said it with a certainty that didn't need explaining. the certainty of a woman who knew how Drew Fossey operated and was not surprised that he had separated from the larger group and come himself, because that was what Fossey did when something mattered enough. "He's faster without the others," Elias said. "He's always faster without the others," Clara said. "He does his best work with a small number of people because a small number of people are easier to keep quiet afterward." She said it with the same flat precision she used for everything, and the implication of it was clear and cold. "How far to Ridgecrest?" she said. 8 miles, he said. "Can we outrun them?" He looked back at the 2 approaching horses. They were gaining. Not quickly, but steadily. The way pursuit gains when the pursuers have fresh horses and the pursued don't. "Not for 8 miles, he said. "Then we need to do something else," she said. "Yes," he said. A beat. "I have an idea," she said. "You won't like it." "Tell me." "We split up," she said. "I take the mare and push for Ridgecrest. You slow them down." "2 men," he said. "One at a time," she said. "You know this kind of country. I don't. Not this specific terrain. But I know Ridgecrest, and I know where Aldous Marsh's office is, and I can get there faster alone on a faster horse." He looked at her. "I don't like it," he said. "I know," she said. "I told you." "If Fossey gets past me." "He won't," she said. "Not because I'm certain of your abilities, though I am, but because Fossey will stop to deal with you if you give him a reason to. He doesn't leave loose ends. It's the way he's built." She held his gaze. "And while he's dealing with you, I get to Ridgecrest." "That's a very cold calculation," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm good at those." A pause, and something shifted in her expression. The control thinning just slightly at the edges. "I don't like it either." He looked at the road behind them. The 2 riders were visible now, 2 shapes moving fast through the winter light, closing ground. He looked at Clara. She was watching him with everything she had. All of that careful, disciplined intelligence focused on him, reading his face, waiting for the answer. "Go," he said. She didn't waste the word. She put her heels to the mare, and the horse leaped forward, and within seconds she was ahead and pulling away. Her dark coat and the bay mare's darker body becoming smaller against the pale road, and Elias turned Dutch sideways across the trail and took his rifle from its scabbard and waited. Fossey pulled up 50 yards out. He had a man beside him that Elias didn't recognize. Big, young, and hard-looking in the way that men sometimes were when they'd committed to something fully. Fossey looked at Elias. Then he looked at the road ahead, where Clara and the mare were becoming a distant shape. "Move your horse, Carter," he said. "Not today," Elias said. Fossey's expression had moved past calculation into something harder. "You cannot stop this," he said. "Wherever she's going, Harlan has reach. Ridgecrest, Denver, wherever. Harlan has people and money and legal arrangements that go places you haven't been and can't follow." "Maybe," Elias said, "but she's already been to all those places ahead of him." Fossey's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means," Elias said, "that you rode hard for the wrong thing. Whatever you were coming out here to collect, it's already been filed, already been recorded, already been put in front of people who are going to do something about it." He held Fossey's gaze steadily. "You can go through me and ride into Ridgecrest and find out I'm right, or you can turn around now and get ahead of what's coming." A silence that was different from the other silences. Heavier, containing a different kind of calculation. "You don't know what you're talking about," Fossey said. 6 weeks ago, Aldous Marsh received a package from Clara Whitfield, Elias said. "He's had federal men out of Denver looking at it for most of that time." He paused. "How much time does your boss have left before this becomes something he can't manage?" Fossey sat very still in the saddle. The man beside him looked at Fossey. Foss was looking at Elias, but his eyes had gone somewhere interior, doing that rapid, private recalculation that Elias had seen on the ridge that morning, except this one had higher stakes. "Harlan will know about this conversation," Fossey said. "I expect so," Elias said. "You tell him whatever you need to." Another silence. Then Fossey looked at the man beside him. Something passed between them that Elias couldn't read. Then, Fosse looked back at the road ahead, not at Elias, but past him, at the point where Clara and the mare had long since disappeared. He looked like a man adding up a column of figures and arriving at a sum he didn't want. He turned his horse. The man beside him turned too. They rode west, back the way they'd come, and Elias sat Dutch in the middle of the road and watched them go until he was certain of it. Certain in the way he was certain of things on the mountain, through accumulated knowledge and pattern and instinct rather than hope. Then he turned Dutch east. He pushed the horse to a pace that was not quite the mare's speed, but was everything Dutch had left, and he rode the 8 miles to Ridgecrest, with the winter light going gray and thin around him, and the cold settling deeper as the afternoon wore on. Ridgecrest appeared as a solid shape of buildings at the end of the road, more substantial than Black Hollow. An actual town, with an actual main street, and the particular busy, settled quality of a place that had been there long enough to stop expecting to leave. He found the mare tied in front of a building on the east side of the main street. He pulled up beside her. The building had a sign above the door. A. Marsh, Attorney at Law, Land Records and Civil Matters. He dismounted and went inside. The front room was small and practical. A desk, chairs, shelves of ledgers and files. Behind the desk was a man in his 60s with gray hair and the particular focused quality of someone who spent his life dealing with facts and their consequences. He looked up when Elias came in. Clara was standing beside the desk. She had clearly arrived recently. She still had the mare's cold on her, the flush of hard riding in her cheeks. But she was standing straight, and her voice, when she spoke, was the steady voice he knew. She turned when Elias came in. He saw the whole sequence of it in the space of a second. The relief, and the effort she made to contain it, and the fact that she didn't quite succeed, and the way she looked at him with an expression that was done pretending to be less than it was. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," he said. "Fosse turned back," he said. "He'll go back to Harlan." She looked at him for a moment, reading his face with that complete, quiet attention. "They're going to need to hear everything," she said, nodding toward the man behind the desk. "From both of us. Everything we know, everything you saw on the mountain, everything about Fosse this morning." She paused. "Are you ready for that?" Elias looked at her. "I thought about 9 years on a mountain alone. About twin tracks going up and no tracks coming down. About a woman standing in a saloon wearing thin shoes and an expression like someone who had already decided what their life was worth. About 8 days in a cabin and a plan built at a table in firelight. About a laugh over a ruined coffee pot that had stayed with him the rest of that day." "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." She turned to the lawyer. "This is Elias Carter," she said. "He's going to need to tell you what he knows about Drew Fosse and the approach routes Harlan's men used." She looked at Elias. "And then we're going to tell you the rest together." Aldous Marsh picked up his pen. Outside, the winter light was fading, and Ridgecrest was going about its business, unaware of what was happening inside the modest office on the east side of the main street. The careful, methodical assembling of everything that Caleb Harlan had worked for years to keep buried. Elias Carter sat down across the desk from the lawyer. Clara Whitfield sat beside him. And they began to talk. Aldous Marsh worked through the night. That was the first thing Elias understood about the man. That he was the kind of lawyer who treated urgency as a professional obligation rather than an imposition, and who understood that certain windows, once closed, did not reopen. He sent his assistant out twice in the first hour, once to the telegraph office, and once to a building 3 streets over, that he described only as a federal contact I've been cultivating for 2 years. And by the time the town outside had gone fully dark and quiet, there were 4 people in the office instead of 2. Elias and Clara on one side of the desk, Aldous Marsh behind it, and a compact, careful-eyed man named Samuel Greer, who introduced himself as a deputy federal marshal out of Denver, and who listened to everything that followed with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people whose job it is to turn testimony into action. Clara talked for nearly 2 hours. Elias had heard most of it already, in pieces, across the days in the cabin, assembled gradually the way a person assembles something difficult when they're still deciding how much of it to show. But hearing it all at once, in sequence, from the death of her father, to Perdido Springs, to 2 years inside Harlan's operation, to the documents she'd copied, and the claim she'd filed in Durango, hearing it laid out complete and consecutive, and delivered in Clara's steady, precise voice, was a different experience from the fragmentary version he'd received on the mountain. It was also, he understood, an act of considerable courage, not because the telling was emotional. Clara kept it controlled and factual, the way she kept most things, but because she was making herself fully visible for the first time in 5 years, to people with the institutional power to do something about it, which was an irrevocable step. Once this was on the record, it could not be taken back. If Harlan had the reach Fossey had claimed, being on the record was the most exposed position Clara Whitfield had occupied since the night she ran from her father's ranch. She did it anyway. When she finished, Greer asked his questions. Careful, specific, the questions of a man building a structure rather than just gathering information. He asked about specific dates, specific locations, specific names. He asked about the county clerk, Ord Finley, and something moved behind his eyes when Clara described the filing process she'd observed during her time with Harlan's operation. He asked about the forged deed language and the backdating methodology and the names of witnesses who appeared across multiple documents. Clara answered everything. Elias watched her and said nothing, because there was nothing useful he could add to this part. Greer turned to him eventually. "Mr. Carter, you said Fossey turned back when you told him federal men had already seen the documents." "Yes," Elias said. "His reaction when you said that, describe it." Elias thought about it. "He went still," he said. "Not angry. Still. Like a man running numbers and not liking where they came out. He didn't push past you." "No." "Why do you think that is?" Greer said. Elias looked at him. "Because he's Harlan's instrument, not Harlan's replacement. When the calculation changes, his orders change. And his orders, as of this morning on this road, didn't account for federal involvement." Greer nodded slowly. "Which means Harlan didn't know," he said. "Or didn't believe it was possible." He looked at the stack of documents Aldous Marsh had assembled on the desk. "Miss Whitfield, the deed to your father's ranch. The original recording number. 47-19, Clara said. Filed with the Territorial Land Office on March the 12th, 1861. My father's name, James Robert Whitfield. The survey description runs along Cottonwood Creek on the north boundary and the old Hendrick fence line on the east." She paused. "I know it by memory because I read it so many times in Harlan's files that the words stopped looking like words and started looking like something I'd already known." Greer wrote it down. Aldous Marsh looked at Clara across the desk. He was older than his brother Abel and quieter, the kind of man whose silences were purposeful. "Your father would be very proud of you," he said. It was the simplest possible thing to say, and Clara Whitfield, who had survived 5 years and a poker game and 8 armed men on a mountain ridge and a 40-mile winter road without losing her composure, looked at the desk surface for a long moment and said nothing. Then she said, "I know." And Elias, watching her, understood that those 2 words cost more than anything else she had said that night. Greer left before midnight with the documents and a list of names and a tight, specific plan that he described in broad terms and did not elaborate on, which was fine because none of them needed the elaboration. He said he would be in communication with Aldous Marsh, that there were things already in motion that this evening had accelerated, and that both Clara and Elias should stay in Ridgecrest for the next several days at minimum. He shook Elias's hand. He looked at Clara for a moment. "You did a difficult thing," he said, "over a long time. The kind of thing most people talk themselves out of." Clara met his eyes. "I had a reason," she said. "My father's land. His name." "Yes," Greer said. "And I think it's going to matter." He left. The office was quiet. Aldous Marsh stood and stretched and looked at the 2 of them with the pragmatic concern of a man who had just spent 4 hours processing an enormous amount of information and was now thinking about practical next steps. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over," he said. Widow named Mrs. Farwell runs it. Honest and discreet. I'll walk you over." He looked at Clara. "You'll want to sleep." "I don't know that I can," she said. "Try anyway," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll need you functional." They walked through the cold night streets of Ridgecrest. Aldous in front, Clara and Elias side by side, their breath making small clouds in the dark air. The town was fully quiet at this hour, the kind of settled silence that belonged to places that had been through enough winters to stop being surprised by them. Clara walked beside Elias, and she was close enough that their arms were almost touching, and neither of them moved to create more distance, which was a thing they were both aware of, and neither of them addressed directly. They reached the boarding house. Aldous spoke quietly with Mrs. Farwell, a solid woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who had long ago decided to organize the world into problems she could solve and problems she couldn't, and to focus exclusively on the former. She showed Clara upstairs without ceremony or questions. Elias stood in the front room and watched her go. At the top of the stairs, Clara paused and turned. She looked down at him. "Elias," she said. He looked up. She seemed to be deciding something, measuring it, the way she measured most things, for weight and consequence before committing. Then she said, "Thank you, for all of it. The coins on the table, and the mountain, and the road, and today." A pause. "I know I said I'd stop thanking you, but this is the last time and I want it said clearly." He looked at her. The staircase was between them, and the lamplight was low, and she looked like herself, completely, unmistakably herself, not performing anything, not containing anything, just standing there at the top of Mrs. Farwell's stairs, being the person she actually was. "Get some sleep, Clara," he said. Something moved in her face. "Good night, Elias," she said. She went up, and he heard the door close. He stood in the quiet front room for a moment, thinking about nothing specific and everything general, the way a person does when the action has stopped and the meaning of it is just starting to arrive. Then he sat down in the chair Mrs. Farwell indicated and, despite everything, slept. The next 10 days were the strangest of Elias Carter's recent memory. He had spent 9 years on a schedule entirely of his own devising, answering to nothing but the mountain seasons and his own requirements. Ridgecrest was a different kind of existence. People, noise, the particular rhythm of a working town, meetings with Greer and Aldous Marsh that required sitting in chairs in heated rooms and being precise and patient and waiting for processes that moved at institutional pace rather than mountain pace. I was not, by nature, a man built for waiting, but he was a man built for endurance, which was adjacent enough. Clara, he discovered, was considerably better at this portion of things than he was. She moved through those days in Ridgecrest with a focused purpose that he recognized. The same purpose she'd brought to the cabin, the same quality of organized intelligence applied now to the legal and bureaucratic machinery that Greer's involvement had set in motion. She met with Aldous every morning. She reviewed documents. She wrote formal statements, careful and precise. And when Aldous told her that the territorial governor's office had been contacted and was reviewing the county clerk situation in the Eastern District, she received the news with the composed satisfaction of a person watching a long-set plan arrive at its intended destination. She was good at this, remarkably good. On the 4th day in Ridgecrest, Greer came back from a meeting in Denver and told them that Ord Finley, the county clerk, had resigned his position 2 days prior and left the territory. He said it without particular drama, as a report of facts, but the implications were clear. Finley had decided that the mathematics of his situation no longer favored staying. On the 6th day, they received word that Drew Fossey had been taken into federal custody at a way station outside Durango. The information was brief, and Greer offered no elaboration except to say that Fossey had been cooperative, which was the word he used and which contained, Elias understood, its own entire story about what Fossey had decided when the mathematics changed. Clara heard this standing in Aldous Marsh's office, with her hands folded in front of her. She was quiet for a moment after Greer said it. Then she said, "And Harlan?" "Working on it," Greer said. "He's careful. He's had years to build distance between himself and the documented actions. But it's moving." "How long?" she said. I can't give you a number, Greer said. I can tell you it's moving. She nodded. She accepted that the way she accepted most things that were outside her control, not happily, but practically, reserving her energy for the things she could still influence. Elias was watching her from across the room when she looked up and caught him at it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the room and stood beside him near the window, and they looked out at the Ridgecrest Main Street together for a moment without speaking. You're thinking about the mountain, she said. Some, he said. You should go back, she said. You've been here 6 days. Your trap lines are fine, he said. I've left them longer. She looked at him. Elias. Clara, he said back, in the exact same tone she used when she was telling him to stop deflecting. She almost smiled at that. Almost. I don't need you to stay, she said. Things are in motion. Aldous is here. Greer is involved. I'm safe in Ridgecrest, and I know what to do next. I know you don't need me to stay, he said. A pause. Then why are you? She said. He looked out the window. The street was busy with midday traffic. Wagons, horses, people going about the ordinary business of a town that had no idea what had been assembled in the lawyer's office over the past 6 days. Because I want to, he said. The words were simple, and he meant them simply, and he looked at her when he said them, so there was no ambiguity about it. Clara looked back at him. The thing that had been building between them since the first morning in the cabin, since coffee on a cold stove and a ruined pot, and a laugh that she'd tried to take back and couldn't, was right there in the space between them, visible and real and not small. That's a significant thing to say, she said carefully. I know, he said. Given the circumstances. I know the circumstances, he said. I was in most of them. She looked at the window. I'm going to have a lot of things to sort out, she said. The ranch. The legal process. Whatever comes with Harlan's case. That's months of... I know, he said again. You live on a mountain. I do. It's not an easy life. I'm aware, he said. I've been living it. She turned to look at him fully, and there was something in her expression that was the most undefended he had ever seen from her. More open than the morning she'd told him about her father. More vulnerable than the night she'd sat up in the dark, not knowing what was on the other side of surviving. You don't know me very well yet, she said. Not really. No, he agreed. I'd like to. Silence. I'm difficult, she said. I've been told that. You're precise, and you don't suffer foolishness, and you have very high standards for the people and situations around you, he said. That's not difficult. That's honest. She stared at him. You've been paying attention, she said. Since the saloon, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. That complete, quiet attention that he had come to understand was the most genuine thing she gave anyone, because she spent it carefully and didn't waste it on things she didn't mean. All right, Elias, she said finally. And she said it the way she'd said it that morning in the cabin when she sat down across the table and agreed to talk, with the full weight of a person who had measured the ground and found it solid enough to step forward. All right, he said. They were still standing at the window when Aldous Marsh came back into the room with a fresh document in his hand and looked at the two of them and then looked at the document and said, with the professionalism of a man who had seen a great deal and knew when to concentrate on paperwork, Miss Whitfield, I need you to review this survey description. Clara stepped away from the window. Of course, she said. But she looked at Elias once more before she turned, and what was in her expression was not complicated at all. It was simply, yes. 3 weeks later, Caleb Harlan was arrested at his ranch in the Southern Territory by 4 federal marshals and a contingent from the territorial governor's office. The charges were numerous and specific and documented with the kind of evidentiary precision that made defense difficult. Land fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and a count connected to the death of James Whitfield that had enough supporting material to move forward to trial. Elias heard about it in Ridgecrest, where he was still staying, because there were things to do there that kept him, and because the boarding house had decent coffee, and Mrs. Farwell had stopped treating him like a temporary guest, and started setting a place for him at the regular breakfast table, which was its own kind of verdict. Clara heard about it standing in Aldous Marsh's office with a document in her hand. She was quiet for a long time after Greer delivered the news. Then she set the document down on the desk, and she pressed her hands flat on the surface. That gesture, that steadying press. And she stood there for a moment that belonged only to her, paying something private. Elias was at the doorway. He didn't go in. She looked up eventually and saw him there. "They got him," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at her hands on the desk. "My father's land." "Still yours," Greer said, from his chair by the window. "The claim is valid, and the forged transfer is null. It'll take time to process through the territorial system, but Aldous has the documentation, and it's clean. It will hold." He paused. "You can go home, Miss Whitfield." Clara looked at the desk surface. Home. 5 years since that word had meant anything. She straightened. She looked at Greer. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." He nodded. "You did the hard part," he said. "Twice over." She turned and walked to the door where Elias was standing, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked at him the way she had at the window 3 weeks ago, without defense, without performance, without the careful control she'd spent years building to keep herself safe from a world that had proven it couldn't be trusted. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. "To the ranch?" "To start," she said. "There's a lot of work. The buildings will need assessment. The land records need to be gone through. The herd is long since gone, but the grazing rights revert with the deed." She paused. "It's going to take time." "Sounds like a project," he said. "It is," she said. "A large one." A pause. "I can't offer you certainty. I don't have a clean picture of what this looks like on the other side of it. I only know what I want to move toward." "What do you want to move toward?" he said. She looked at him. "Something real," she said simply. "Something built on honest ground between people who see each other clearly." She held his gaze. "You see me clearly." "Yes," he said. "And I—" She stopped, took a breath that was steadier than what it contained. "I see you too, Elias Carter. All of it. The mountain and the 9 years, and the man who put his last coins on a poker table for a stranger." She paused. "I see you, and I'm not afraid of any of it." The doorway of Aldous Marsh's law office was not a dramatic setting for a moment like this one. It was practical and narrow, and smelled of paper and wood smoke, and the particular dry warmth of a heated room in winter. But Elias Carter had spent 9 years on a mountain, learning that meaning didn't require grand settings. It arrived where it arrived, and the only question was whether you were paying enough attention to receive it. I was paying attention. "Let's go look at your land," he said. Something moved in Clara Whitfield's face that was not quite a smile, and was more than one. The full, unguarded expression of a woman who had spent 5 years surviving, and was only now, in this narrow doorway in a town she had arrived in as a fugitive, beginning to understand what it felt like to arrive. They left Ridgecrest 2 days later. Abel Marsh had sent word ahead that Dutch had recovered well and was ready for the road, and the bay mare was available for Clara for the journey south, which was Abel Marsh's way of being useful and of saying something that didn't need to be said in words. The road south was different from the road they'd ridden north on under pursuit. It was still cold, still long, still carrying the particular quality of Colorado winter that never entirely relaxed its grip until well into March. But it was not urgent in the way the other road had been. They could move at a pace that allowed for conversation and for silence in equal measure, which was the kind of traveling that suited both of them. They talked, more than they had on the mountain, more than the practical exchanges of the cabin or the tactical calculations of the ridge. They talked the way people talk when they have made a decision, and the decision has created space, real, breathing space, where before there had only been urgency. She told him about her father. Not the facts of his death, which Elias already knew, but the man himself, his particular stubbornness, his belief that education was the most practical thing you could give a child, his habit of reading aloud at the dinner table from whatever book he was working through, his talent for horses, and his impatience with men who lacked it. Elias told her about the mountain, about the first winter, which had nearly killed him, and about what he'd learned from nearly dying that had made the 9 years after it possible. About the morning, 4 years in, when he'd woken to find a wolverine in his lean-to, and the 3 hours it had taken to resolve the situation to both their satisfaction. About the particular quality of silence on the ridge on a clear night in winter, when the stars were close enough to seem architectural. She listened to all of it with the full, focused attention that she gave to things that mattered. He listened to her the same way. It was, he thought, the most he had talked in years. Possibly the most he had ever talked. He had not known he had this much to say, had operated under the assumption that solitude had simply confirmed what he'd suspected, which was that he was not a man built for words. He was revising that assessment. The right listener, it turned out, made a significant difference. On the second day of the journey, they crossed the county line into the valley where the Whitfield ranch had stood for 20 years. Clara went quiet when she recognized the landscape. Elias saw it happen, the way her body changed, the way she sat differently in the saddle, and her eyes started moving over the familiar terrain with an expression that contained too many things at once to name individually. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. They came over a low rise, and the ranch was below them. Not as it had been, not the working operation her father had built, but the bones of it. The main house still standing, weathered but structurally intact. The barn with one wall gone, salvageable. The fences down in most places. The land itself, the creek along the north boundary, the old fence line to the east. All of it recognizable, all of it still there in the way. Land is always still there when everything built on top of it has changed. Clara stopped the mare on the rise and looked at it for a long moment. Elias stopped Dutch beside. She didn't speak for almost a minute. Then she said quietly, "He built that house himself. Spent the whole first summer on it before he planted anything. He said a man who built his shelter before his crops had his priorities right." A pause. "He was very specific about having his priorities right." "He sounds like he was," Elias said. "The barn wall," she said. "That's a few weeks of work," he said. "Straightforward." She looked at him. "You know barn construction." "I know construction," he said. "I built a cabin on a ridge. Same principles." She looked back at the ranch. "It's going to take a long time," she said, "to make it what it was." "Yes," he said. "Maybe something different than what it was," she said. "I don't know yet what the right version of it is." "You'll figure it out," he said. "You're good at figuring things out." She looked at him. "We'll figure it out," she said. Not a correction exactly. More like a precise adjustment. The kind Clara Whitfield made when language needed to reflect reality accurately. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." They rode down the rise toward the house. The creek was running low under its ice, and the dead grass showed through the snow in patches, and the old cottonwoods along the north fence were bare and gray and enormous, the way old cottonwoods get when they've been standing in one place long enough to stop looking like trees and start looking like landmarks. Clara dismounted at the front of the house and stood looking at the door. Weathered wood, still hanging on its hinges. And then she put her hand on it and pushed it open. The inside was cold and stripped of everything movable, as expected, as years of absence created. But the walls were solid, and the fireplace was intact, and the floor, when Clara stepped on it, held without complaint. She stood in the middle of the empty room. Elias stood in the doorway behind her. She turned around slowly, taking in the dimensions and the light and the fact of being inside it again. And her face in that moment was something he was glad to be witness to. Not the composed, controlled face she showed the world. Not even the open face she showed him in private moments. But something deeper than both of those. The face of a person standing inside a loss that had been recovered. The face of someone who has carried something a long way and set it down in the right place. "Hello," she said to the room. Quiet. Private. Elias looked at the far wall, giving her the moment. Then she turned and looked at him standing in the door, and she said, "It needs a new coffee pot." He looked at her. "The one at the cabin is ruined," she said. "We established that early on, and this kitchen will need one. So we should get one that's adequate to the purpose and not wait until it's a problem." I understood that she was talking about something practical and something else simultaneously, and that this was how Clara Whitfield announced things, sideways and precise and in language that could be taken at its face value or understood more fully depending on whether you'd been paying attention. He had been paying attention. "We'll get a good one," he said. "Something that lasts." She nodded. She came back to the door where he was standing, and she stood beside him, and they both looked out at the land, at the creek and the cottonwoods and the broken fence and the barn with the missing wall and all of it waiting, patient in the way that land is patient, for whatever came next. "My father always said the hardest part of anything worth doing was the beginning," she said. "That once you got the foundation right, the rest was just work." "Smart man," Elias said. "Very," she said. He was also right. She stepped forward, off the threshold, back into the winter air, and she looked up at the sky and then back at him with an expression that was clear and full and entirely her own. "Let's get the foundation right," she said. He stepped out of the door and stood beside her. They stood on the land that had been stolen and recovered in the winter of 1882, in the Colorado Territory. Two people who had each spent a long time believing that surviving alone was the same thing as living, and who had discovered in the space of 3 weeks and 40 hard miles that it was not the same thing at all, that living required something surviving could not provide, which was another person who saw you clearly and stood beside you anyway. Elias Carter had walked into a saloon on the coldest night of the year, looking for a quiet place to wait, and had walked out of it with a woman who changed the dimensions of every room he entered afterward. Clara Whitfield had spent 5 years making herself invisible, had let the world call her worthless because the alternative was being found, and had arrived at a poker table in a mining town at the exact moment that a silent mountain man decided that some things were worth every coin he had. They were not a fairy tale. They were two people who had survived difficult things and chosen, with full knowledge of what the other person contained, the scars and the silences and the stubbornness and the strength, to build something real on honest ground. And in the Colorado Territory, in the winter of 1882, that was worth more than gold. It was worth everything.